The race is on, and with Oscar Piastri's 6-month stint at the head of the championship at an end, we ask what's gone wrong and if he's cracking under the intense pressure of a title fight. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to dissect the McLaren driver's recent struggles and what it means for the run-in are Diego Mejia and Ben Anderson. Diego, it's been far too long since we've had you on this podcast. As many listeners will know, you're the voice of the race in Spanish on YouTube. Had a very busy weekend in Mexico, of course, given your star status in the LATAM region. Now, Oscar Piastri, his struggles in Mexico were a big storyline. To paraphrase a question we've been getting a lot recently, is the long-time points leader cracking under pressure?
Yeah, we have seen probably many unforced errors from Oscar since the end of the European season. We have to go back to the multiple crashes in Baku, his failed start there. Then you bridge tempers running high in Singapore with his teammate, with his Austin crash in the sprint, and yet another poor start here in Mexico. Under pressure after not being able to replicate Lando's pace. We didn't see that many mistakes from him in the first part of the championship. So, yes, he has also shown flashes of the great Oscar, who became McLaren's leader in that time. His move on Russell this weekend was a 10 out of 10 for execution, I think. But as cool as he has been for most of the year, we have seen some cracks of late, I think.
It's an interesting question, isn't it, Ben? Because there's some elements where you see different weaknesses and different struggles and different reasons. So obviously Baku, as Diego mentioned, was a kind of disaster weekend. Yeah. But Singapore was frustrating. But he was a little bit quicker than Norris in qualifying. And had he stayed ahead of him at the start, he'd have finished ahead. So You've got these ups and downs, haven't you? And I guess the key is unravelling what's the cause and what's the effect.
There obviously is a pattern in the sense that you see a run of races where things have gone against him compared to an earlier run of races where things seem to be going for him more often than not. But I don't think all of those moments are connected with each other. You know, Baku was a bad weekend full of errors, but it was a bad weekend for Norris as well. It was a bad weekend for McLaren. So it wasn't like Piastri was kind of out on his own being terrible and while the rest of the team was being brilliant. And as you say, Singapore, he was actually ahead. He was, he felt hard done by to get bumped out the way by Norris and then not have retribution from the team. So you could say actually that was a strong weekend that just had a bad outcome for him. The difficult bit is the Austin, Mexico pattern, because both of those races were hot tracks but low grip, lots of sliding. The McLaren should have been quite good in those circumstances, and it was. And Norris showed with a really strong drive in the race in Austin, and then obviously in Mexico where he was brilliant, probably the best he's ever been, certainly the best this season, that it was possible to win there. And Piastri just wasn't on the pace. And you could have looked at Austin and said, well, that's kind of an isolated thing. It's track specific. He was bad in Austin last year. It was probably his weakest weekend, certainly one of them. And, it's a sprint. It's difficult to have the track time to kind of work on things, especially if you don't hit the ground running in the way, say, Nico Hülkenberg did for Sauber in that weekend. But it carried across to Mexico. And what you don't want to see is that pattern then continued for the remainder of the tracks in this short running, because then if it does happen like that, he's in big trouble.
Yeah, it makes Interlagos a really important weekend, doesn't it, Diego? Because you could look at some specific reasons why this past double header was a problem for him. But if you go to Interlagos, a track where on paper those problems shouldn't hit him, if he's struggling again, then you start to question other factors, don't you? Because the whole thing about the track-specific challenge is we've seen it the other way around. I was going back through the season just to refresh my memory, and some of the stuff that Stella was saying about, in this track, it plays into Lando Norris's strengths and against Oscar's. If you go to, say, China, he was saying the opposite way around. He said, these conditions with wind conditions and front graining, that plays into Oscar's hands against Lando, and Lando struggles. So in that regard, it's not something we haven't seen before the other way around. So it's all about, does this continue into Brazil, where I don't think there's any specific track reason why it should?
Yeah, exactly. It should be, you would say more of a level playground for both drivers. But at the same time, what if it rains, We could be back to low grip situation and anything could happen there. And it would be a great news for Max based on what happened last year and what unfolded there in 2016 before that. So, it's strange in some way. You could argue that there is not a trend, but I think we have to go back to some extent to Monza and what happened there, because obviously there's all sorts of conspiracy theories doing the rounds. We'll talk about that later, and the booing on at the end of the race for Lando, but definitely that was a race that set a trend and sent a message. At some point, you'd have to say that we have seen Oscar's temper race in Monza, then the race after that in Singapore, and since Monza, basically his season has entered this slump. He won the race before, which was the Netherlands, a race which was a big hit in terms of the championship because of Lando's non-finish. But I think as we close on the decisive races of the year, it's definitely having some more weight on Oscar's shoulders. With only 1 point and 116 on the table, 1 point is basically nothing. So we're back to, a tie for the championship basically at this point, and we're having 4 more races to sprints, and it could swing Oscar's way, and he could be back in the lead of the championship next race. But he needs to make sure that he executes perfectly, because Lando is back to his best. He's back to his best self-confidence, I guess. We didn't see any cracks in Mexico this weekend. I would say it's been his best race so far. So it's not the Lando that was making the mistakes at the beginning of the year and the middle of the year. So Oscar has to raise his game even further, I think, than he was at the beginning of the season. And you look at the tracks that are remaining in the calendar, and you'd say, well, Qatar has to be the track for Oscar, based on the latest statement from Andrea Stella. Is the track full of very fast corners. He actually won for the first time in F1 there, his sprint, actually before Lando had won a race in F1. So that is a track that should see him be at his best. There will be 33 points on the table there. Will it be too late? Probably not, looking at how this is unfolding. But I think, Oscar not only has to go back to his best, but he has to go a step forward because Lando is really showing he's got the momentum right now.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to mention Norris and the step he's taken. It feels a little bit familiar to me compared to last season, when Norris was being talked as, well, not by you, Ed, but by others, as an outside title contender against Verstappen. He seemed to tighten up. And at that point, Piastri looked stronger. And then as soon as they started coming to blows at this phase of the season, Austin and Mexico both featured clashes. Brazil, Norris was on pole, but then the race unraveled in the wet. And by that point, it was over. That Verstappen win kind of, put it to bed. And then he drove with freedom again and finished the season really strongly. And you felt, actually, this is, when Norris hasn't got the kind of weight of the world on his shoulders, this is what he can do. And I feel like that's happened again this year, but a bit earlier because of that Zandvoort engine failure you mentioned, Diego. He kind of, it's not quite Lewis Hamilton in Malaysia 2016, but it's similar in the sense that it's like, this is a big blow, nothing I can do about it. And it's now out of my hands. I'm not kind of in this nip and tuck battle for points at every Grand Prix. I just have to kind of do my best and see what happens. And he's gone into this kind of groove where his performances have been generally quite strong, with Baku aside. But I think that was, as I said before, the team. And I'm not sure that Piastri's exactly tightened up, but the more that this slump goes on, even if there are different reasons at different events for it, the more it has to get into your head. He needs to have a big result to turn it around. And Brazil is an opportunity because the track suits McLaren, as you've said. But again, it's a Norris stronghold. So Piastri's got to take a step there, as he has done at other tracks this year where he was weak last year, to get on terms. Even Qatar, which I would say is a more McLaren track, he was behind Norris there. He looked less comfortable in the car. It was close because obviously that track is short and it's quite fast, and the lap time differences aren't great. But there wasn't really anywhere apart from Vegas where he had the edge on Norris in this final run of tracks last year. And that obviously was a front graining race. So again, it plays into that phenomenon earlier in the season when the tracks are a bit colder and the front's a limitation. That suits Oscar. But this run of the season has not been like that. It's been much more kind of hot, slidey, difficult to feel the car. And I wonder if that digression on the front suspension that Norris made much earlier in the season helps him in these kind of situations where you need a little bit more responsiveness from the front, and he's just been able to get those rotations that Oscar hasn't managed to do. So maybe that upgrade that Piastri rejected earlier in the season because he didn't think it was faster is starting to go against him.
Yeah, we should say that upgrade. It's always been described as a setup option, and it gives you more feel. So it's not like it hypothetically creates more lap time, but it might allow a driver to exploit more lap time through that feel and sensitivity. But I think it's a valid point, and I think he might come to rue not at least trying that a little bit earlier in the season. Yeah. He's not a driver that wants the same sensitivity because they've got very different driving styles as Norris, but he might come to think perhaps I should have experimented with that a bit just in case there's events where I need it. But let's continue on this topic through a few questions from the Race Members Club. These it's actually a few are carried over from Mexico, a few are carried over from USA, but they're all about Oscar Piastri. So the first one I'm going to throw at you, Diego. It's from Adpo, who actually prefaced this question with, is Piastri starting to crack? So kind of gave the whole angle for the podcast episode. Are we seeing last year's pattern repeating as he underperforms in the final stages of the championship, perhaps because the leap in performance potential over the winter allows him to overreach during the season relative to his experience and accumulate stress and fatigue he's unprepared for? And Mitchell Woolner asks if this is a natural growing pain for a 24-year-old still learning how to carry a title fight. Interesting point, isn't it? Because this is about the intangibles, the unmeasurables, certainly from the outside in terms of those effects. And as Andrea Stella has said, Diego, we have to bear in mind this is still only Piastri's third season.
Yeah, which is quite easy to forget given his performances this year, So, before the summer break, it looked like he was much closer to the finished product that he has looked to be since we came back from the summer break. And what Ben was mentioning, I think is part of it, With experience, maybe he would have tried this update in Canada and maybe tried it back in another place, but he chose his path and that's where he's going. And unfortunately now, maybe too late to turn back because he has developed the feeling of the car with the suspension choices that he took since they had that option back in Canada. So absolutely, there's an experience element to this, which plays more into Lando's more years in F1, more years with McLaren, more years with the team. We know very well which have been Lando's weaknesses. We still have to see which are actually Oscar's one, I think, because he has shown to be so strong even mentally this year. But if anything, inexperience or the lack of the same level of experience as his teammate is definitely one of those. And that can play in many different ways. His manager, Mark Webber, can help him on those things that have to do with, managing situations outside the track, maybe some on the track. I wouldn't go as far as saying he would make, driving, be a driver coach or anything close to that, but he definitely has been in the thick of a world championship battle. This is very reminiscent in some way of what happened in 2010 when he looked to be the favorite to get the championship, the first one for Red Bull, and ended up losing out to Sebastian Vettel. This time it's quite the opposite. You would say the young guy is the Vettel of this is Piastri, but unfortunately it's playing in the opposite way, and he is hitting his most difficult part of the season at crunch time, basically. But he can still get it done. And I'm sure Mark is keen on reversing what happened in 2010 and making sure Australia gets a world championship this time.
Yeah, and it's why we were talking about this earlier in the season. It was going to be interesting to see how Piastri reacts to this pressure and challenge, because although it affects people in different ways, it's an unmeasurable factor, but it's unquestionably there. And you see this in all sports, isn't it? When it really comes down to the crunch and everything matters, it can have different effects on different people. And until you've been through that, until you've been there in these really weird situations, speaking to for world champion the other day, said you just don't know what it's like until you're kind of in that scenario. And that's what Piastri's learning, on top of the fact that he's still probably learning how best to manage himself over a season. And all drivers talk about this. They tend to say kind of one year to another, they get better at managing their energy and resources, etc. Because it's as we all know, these are long old seasons, aren't they? And they, even in what we're doing, which is somewhat easier than what Oscar Piastri's having to do, it kind of takes it out of you. So for him, it's that times a million, if you like. But a next question, Ben, from Jack Aitken. He says, have the car's traits moved away from Piastri's liking, or has his confidence just taken a hit?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the car traits. I mean, as I said, maybe the suspension thing has played a role, and it's not that the car's moved away from him. It's more that, I mean, McLaren hasn't been developing the car since the summer. They took their decision, didn't they, to stop the iterative development and focus on 26, and they're just trying to eke the performance out while Red Bull throws more and more front wings and floor flicks at Verstappen's car in the hope of putting them under pressure. So the car has been quite consistent, but that suspension choice he made so many months ago might just be hurting him, in the sense that he's been a bit closed-minded to that when he was on a good run, and now that he's struggling, he's lost an option that could have been there to help him. He's just going to have to ride through that. I think he might have lost a bit of confidence. I felt like that was maybe the case after qualifying in Mexico, because he was so far off and he felt like he was driving well. It's always really, really difficult to compute if you can't find an obvious explanation in yourself for why the performance isn't there. You know, if he was saying, I'm struggling this particular bit, or the car isn't just giving me this here, it was all around the lap, every bit. It was actually quite reminiscent of when Norris is at his best, what Daniel Ricciardo experienced as his teammate. You could. I mean, it happened a lot more often, unfortunately for Ricciardo. But you could watch qualifying laps. There's a famous one that we've talked about many times, Ed, from France, I think 2021, where you could just see, like, through the lap where Ricciardo's lack of confidence in the car was just compounding the lap time almost in every corner. And you couldn't say, oh, you know, he's shipped half a second or a quarter of a second here, and that's added up to the deficit. It was just compound everywhere. And I think Mexico was probably the first time we've seen clearly Piastri in that position where he just hasn't got an answer. What we don't know is the work he put in overnight from Saturday to Sunday. In the race, although the start was difficult, as Diego mentioned, he kept himself out of trouble, capitalised on others' mistakes in what was a very scrappy race from other people, and ended up in the top five. So it was a good damage limitation, and his race pace looked good. His move on Russell, as Diego said, was 10 out of 10, excellent, aggressive. He didn't look in the race like a driver who'd lost his confidence. If anything, he looked like a driver who'd done what Piastri does, which is try to work everything out, put it all together and make a step. It's just this time, the step didn't come early enough in the weekend for him to have any kind of answer to Norris.
Yeah, probably. I think Oscar was expecting to make the most out of having FP1, you know, to get what he had not been able to get in the previous times he had been here in Mexico, because it was clear that it was a track where Lando was able to be a step above his performance. But
FP1's
Lando,
worthless though, isn't it? That's the trouble. Like Mexico is effectively a 2 practice session Grand Prix. And
the way Lando started his weekend, I mean, the car wasn't perfect because we saw him struggling around the S's, but the lap time was still coming. So he had the confidence right from the go. And in terms of his qualifying, I was also like trying to get a proper explanation, which obviously Oscar, I think, doesn't have yet, but try to understand what was going on. And I spoke to a few race drivers with the telemetry in hand to try to understand what their points of views were. And I think what I got from them is you can see the steering trace of both drivers, and you could see the amplitude of the steering on Oscar's car was much bigger, the amplitude, which shows you that he was having understeering in some places, having to correct in others. But you could see that Lando's was less amplitude, but more small corrections. And the way he was steering the car was just inch perfect. And to be able to replicate that all the time in the race to keep the tires in the right window and be so much faster than anyone to finish 30 seconds ahead of your closest rivals just shows that he had the measure of that. And he he was able to do things with the car that unfortunately Oscar wasn't. This will be a lesson, because hopefully we'll see them being teammates for many years more, until something happens. Because when two big talents, crash against it, not on the track, but collide in terms of the rivalry, it's difficult to see them going together for too many years. But hopefully that's the case, and the papaya rules keep peace inside McLaren for many years. But I'm sure that at some stage Oscar will be able to get the hang of what Lando has been doing to make such a big gap this weekend in Mexico.
Yeah, what you're talking about there, I think, is one of the reasons why I would expect Piastri to be stronger again at Interlagos. That there are kind of mental challenges and pressure challenges going on as well, but they've got quite different default driving styles, Norris and Piastri. Norris does much more overlapping steering and brake. He's got that great sensitivity, and that kind of allows him to get the best out of conditions like Mexico better than, say, Piastri, who combines a hell of a lot less. He's a little bit more, I said not as a pejorative, he's a little bit more simple in his driving technique, and that works brilliantly sometimes, but not others. There was an interesting quote, actually, after the race. Piastri was talking about the fact that, well, the car hasn't changed, and I think Lando is perhaps a little bit better able to get the best out of it in these conditions. And he said, it's more about adding some tools to the toolbox rather than reinventing myself. And that's the key, I think. He will, from these weekends, because he had this a bit in Austin, not quite to the same extent, he will need to think, okay, there are circumstances and modes where I need to be able to switch a little bit, to have that sensitivity to react to all these kind of tiny microslides and all those kinds of things that Norris can, that I couldn't in Mexico. So that's the good thing. If we were talking about this and there was no proper, adequate, consistent explanation that matches what we know about these two drivers, I'd be thinking, yeah, he's just completely tightening up. He's just kind of all over the place and stiff. And you could interpret that from watching the onboards. But having kind of followed the onboards, looked at the data and knowing what I know about them, everything Andrea Stella was saying about the problems kind of added up. And of course, that could be blown out of the water if it's the same in Interlagos. But at least the picture for me seems consistent. But that's the problem with trends, isn't it? When they're emerging, you can kind of find specific reasons early on, but you need a certain number of events to string it all together to create kind of a new trend, don't you?
And the sample set's too small as well, isn't it? It's 2 races, 2 very specific challenges, as McLaren have explained, quite well suited to the way Norris drives naturally, not as well suited to the way Oscar drives naturally. We can probably put to bed the conspiracy theories about the car, or whether it's possible there's some kind of, carryover damage on the car, but that seems unlikely because the nature of that Austin sprint collision would have been more the extremities, not something core to the chassis. And it doesn't seem like Piastri can't do anything in all situations. Like, his race was fine. As I say, he had the confidence to race George Russell, and you wouldn't be doing that if the car was no good. I think it's important to recognise also there's just ebbs and flows in these kind of battles, and there are always going to be tracks where certain drivers they fit better, and we know, as you mentioned, Ed, Lando is his sensitivity. There's been other drivers like this. I think Jenson Button was a bit like this, Kimi Räikkönen too. That can hold you back in a lot of situations because you need the kind of this certain extra bit of perfection, if you like, from the car and your situation within it to get the most out of yourself. But when you get that, you're unstoppable. And it could just be that Norris found a very particular groove in Mexico. I don't think anyone was beating him. Even if Piastri had a cleaner weekend, or if he redid the weekend, or Verstappen was in the other car, it could just be one of those absolutely mighty Norris weekends, which he can't have 24 times a season. So his kind of pattern, if there is one, is that there'll be points in the season where he's absolutely untouchable, but then a few points where actually he's quite average. Whereas Piastri seems like the kind of driver who's a bit more kind of consistently on one level, but you don't get quite the same peaks of performance even when he's at his best.
Yeah, it's a good point. A few times this season when Norris has had a mighty weekend, we thought, oh, right, will he kick on? And then he doesn't. So
yeah, exactly,
that's the other question. So, yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Norris in a bit more detail later on, but that's an important question to keep in mind. We've still got a few more questions about Oscar Piastri. So this one, Diego, I'd be interested to get your say on it, because we've been asked a lot about these sorts of things, and is there a kind of British favouritism as well towards Lando Norris, and are we as well, the race isn't all British people, but some British people, are we part of the conspiracy? So I'm pleased to get an impartial, non-British voice on this.
Yeah, it's the Lando Norris era.
Exactly,
Go Lando. I'm waving my flag.
Absolutely. So this question from Will Witchell relates to that. Is the reason for the sudden struggles of Piastri due to McLaren possibly stopping sharing telemetry data between garages after they won the Constructors' Championship? Is this an explanation for Piastri's struggles or just coincidental timing? And we should add to that, I think there have been some reports somewhere about this, but...
have there? Because I couldn't find them.
Well, yeah. Well, you can find just about everything reported, can't you? But Diego is going to tell us the real story. Cool.
Absolutely not. But I'm not sure if there's anything related to this data sharing on the papaya rules once you win the Constructors' Championship. I wouldn't think so, because, part of sharing data between both sides of the garage is making sure that the team is at its best, and if it was only Oscar versus Lando, then maybe, but with Verstappen, you have to get everything you need to get out of the McLaren at every track. So once you stop sharing data, that compromises the ceiling for the team. I mean, one driver can reach the ceiling, maybe the other can't. But the whole team, if the other driver is pushing, they will both go a little further. So, I would be surprised. There could be layers of data that you can share. Maybe you can share up until a certain point, but you could also get to a point where one driver starts to hide pace a little bit, like it's been done many times in the past. A driver knows he has something else under his sleeve, and he only shows that at the right time. But in this case, Lando was already up to Q2 pace in FP3, which has been the case at many races this year when he has been quick in FP3. I think he has led the most FP3 sessions. He has led the most practice sessions of anyone this year, but he's usually able, when he's in a good place, he's able to get closer to the ceiling much earlier than others. And I don't know if he'll be able to sort of measure a little more what he shows on the data to his teammate now that we enter this ultra close battle between them and Verstappen for the championship.
I mean, if they were one-on-one, properly one-on-one, and Verstappen wasn't there flying about in the background, you might consider it just as a kind of play. But the thing is, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? On a weekend where Norris is away and down the road like Mexico, he's going to be like Lewis Hamilton with Nico Rosberg, not wanting to share his data and being quite annoyed that this guy can use it to chip away. And there's maybe a bit of a prevailing narrative in the background of the Norris-Piastri rivalry that because of the way Piastri builds his weekend and then usually delivers in Q3 and maybe pips Norris, that he's basically cribbing off Norris. He's using Norris, as you say, Joe, gets up to the ceiling a bit quicker, and Piastri gets more out of the data sharing than Norris does. But that's not always the case. And in every session, there'll be something you can pick from the other guy's data, even if they're slower than you. So it's kind of self-defeating. It also flies in the face of about 20 or 30 years of technological progress in F1 to just be like, no, we're not data sharing. We're going to create some kind of like Marquez, Rossi, MotoGP split garage nonsense. I don't see it happening. And I also just don't think it's in Norris's personal makeup. Like, to me, he's the kind of competitor who's like, and I think he's even said this in terms of how McLaren and its controversial papaya rules or culture works. They want it to be on the table. He wants it to be build the best car, give us the best tools, and then may the best man win. I don't think he's in the business. Some drivers are not like this. I don't think he's in the business of like actively trying to screw his teammate or play mind games or try to hide things. I just don't think he's got time for that. He just wants to win by being relentlessly the fastest guy on track.
Yeah, and McLaren has set out their stall to try and be even-handed to the drivers. Now that's led to some slight frustrations with the way they've done.
A whole other podcast.
Well, exactly. Yeah, we talked about this in the past, but that's a big part of the team's makeup, rightly or wrongly. And also, if you want evidence of this, I mean, going both ways. I mean, it tends to be framed in terms of is Piastri not getting access to Norris sometimes, but I mean, I watched all of Piastri's Mexico, well, not FP1 because we didn't have access to the onboards because of technical problems, but you can hear it because there's points where Piastri's being given comparisons to Norris, for example, by his race engineer, Tom Stallard. And that shows that the access is there across the two sides because, well, it probably won't be Stallard going up, but you'll have the performance engineer looking at these things and they'll give opportunities where you can gain time. And sometimes that's just from looking purely at Piastri's data, but they'll be doing constant comparisons as well. So it's there in the publicly available stuff, the evidence that there's nothing shutting down. And this is something McLaren, I think, genuinely wants to try and do. They've probably overreached in trying to create fairness, but there have been times historically when there's been limited access to data and telemetry, but it's been a long time since anyone's actually done that because, as Ben said, the teams, you can't work that way anymore. You could in the past, but it's so central to the way everything works. It just isn't really doable. Yeah,
and then going back to what I was mentioning before about not showing your hand totally too early, it's been interesting to learn what Lando's approach has been this year in terms of his qualifying and this thing he mentioned about the delta being on his dash or not, like not having it this year, because when they asked him, I mean, where did that lap come from? And he didn't seem to have a proper explanation, although he may know why he was so quick. But his approach this year is also quite different. And like not knowing so much was better for him in terms of managing the pressures of completing a lap. And around Mexico, you can be perfect sector 1, sector 2, but sector 3, you can easily lose plenty of lap time because of so many slow corners you see there. And I wouldn't say that Lando's hiding any pace, really. He's just being able to get the most out of the car when it is in his happy place.
So maybe it's him who's not having the data from Oscar, because if anything, he's the one who doesn't want the information. So it'd make more sense that he's like, no, don't tell me. I don't want to look at it. I just want to go back to the old school and do everything by feel because it's working for me.
But that point about not having the delta on the dash is an interesting one because that's just an example of a driver who knows what works for them. Because he's built up experience. And so that's all part of the journey Piastri's on in terms of just learning what's the best thing, because there's so much data in Formula One and there is such thing as too much data, because the key is being able to sift through what are the key things, what can you benefit from in the moment, after the fact, etc. What do you need to look at and understand? So that's something you'd expect Norris, just through sheer experience, to have a bit of an advantage of. A question from Gavin Cameron now, Ben. Is the glass half full or half empty for Oscar? He's got 2 tracks out of the way that don't suit him, as well as Baku, and he's only 1 point off the championship lead.
I mean, I think from his point of view, the glass is always the same amount filled, isn't it? He's I know he's had slightly emotional outbursts when McLaren have maybe done him dirty in terms of their adjusting the scales at certain races, but that's been in the moment on the radio. Other than that, he's showing the same even temperedness that he's shown all the way through. That seems to be, I think, one of his biggest strengths. So you look at it, you have to look at it as a half empty in terms of the way things have gone, because he had a big lead. That Norris engine failure, which could have been decisive in the championship battle, that's been eliminated now. So he's kind of, maybe with a bit of help from McLaren at certain points, he's reset the battle, and he's on a bad run. So as I said before, he needs a big race to kind of just arrest the slide. But he's still the guy in proper contention. He's only 1 point behind. That's nothing, isn't it, really? So yeah, he's lost the championship lead. Yeah, things have gone against him. Yeah, Papa rules haven't worked out for him. He's on a bad run. But all he can do is reset, go into the next race, treat it like race 0, if you like, and start again. It's in his hands to beat Norris. And if he can do that, I know Verstappen's still obviously a factor, but the main factor is Norris, isn't it? So as long as Piastri can get back into the business of beating his teammate, then it's his to win, just as much as it's Norris's to win.
A question from number 37 next, who says, how often has Piastri actually extracted the maximum out of his car? I'd argue once in Bahrain. Every other time, Norris has shown more speed, even when not qualifying well. But he's rarely executed when it mattered most in Q3 or making mistakes in the race. Well, I can say Spain. Spain's another one.
Spain, yeah.
There've been a lot, actually. I sort of went back over the season before this podcast just to remind myself, because there's so many races and so much time's passed. It can be very easy to, you remember some bits and forget the others. And it's actually quite interesting, because if you go through the year, I was trying to go through and ascribe to each weekend, right, who underlying had the greater pace of the two McLaren drivers. It can be a tricky thing to come up with one name, because sometimes you get evolution over the weekends. But I actually I've got it basically as that there's 9 weekends when Norris has been quicker, 9 when Piastri has, and there's kind of 2 that I think are just too close to call. Like Zandvoort, for example. If Piastri, there's nothing in it, and if Piastri doesn't get that little toe on his Q3 lap from Hadjar, pole probably goes to Norris, and that changes the narrative, because then he retires from the lead probably with the PU problem. And there have been some that have just been so close. I've got Hungary, much the same, although Piastri had the edge on pace there, but it's. I think there've been quite a few. Piastri was very quick in Miami, although Norris did manage to qualify ahead of him.
He was better in Miami, wasn't he?
Exactly,
in terms of the race when it counted.
Another
he was
one,
decisive and stuff. So
exactly. Yeah, I mean, Silverstone, Piastri just had the edge. Belgium, I think Piastri did. He made a little mistake on his qualifying lap as well for the main race. So
China.
Yeah, China was one where Piastri was fantastic. There have been plenty.
Yeah, no, and actually you mentioned 99, and that's exactly the number. I mean, they're even on pole positions. Both drivers have 5 each, and quali after 20 races is 10-10. So it's too close to call. Only when you look at the sprint shootout qualifying, you see that actually it's 3-1. So that's the only one. But it's so close. It's been so close on the overall picture of the season that it's very difficult. Now the thing is that at this point they're 1 point apart, but the trends are pointing at different directions. Obviously Lando's trend is upwards, and unfortunately for Oscar, his trend is downwards.
That's the thing. I mean, looking at my little list of who was faster, 4 of the last 5 I've got Norris, so that could be said to be a trend. So it's a fascinating battle, and I just love the fact that these are 2 drivers with different approaches and different techniques. That's what makes it such a fascinating one, and difficult to unravel the different contributing factors. But Ben, we've got to remember Piastri's still in a great position. He's 1 point off the lead of the championship. There's 4 Grand Prix, 2 sprints left. How does he reset from here? And what can we perhaps learn from past championship run-ins that could influence how Piastri conducts himself and approaches it, and also how it might play out?
Well, he has to focus on himself, doesn't he? He has to not get distracted by the noise of it, which I don't think he does. Not get carried away with it too much. He has to go race by race. He has to do what Verstappen has said he's been doing, which is just turn up at each race weekend, try to get the maximum out of that race weekend. And if I do that and I win races, the championship will take care of itself. That's all Piastri can do as well. He needs to not chase it too hard. I think the big lesson, you mentioned 2010 earlier, Diego, I think that's a good approximation. And the interesting element of Mark Webber being involved in that, there was a key race, wasn't there, Ed? I think Korea, where Webber was in a good position, and he behind Vettel, and he went after him and crashed, trying to chase him down for the win when he needed to just accept he wasn't going to turn him over that weekend, bank the points, and it would have changed the situation going into the final bit of the championship. That's the kind of thing you've really got to avoid. Don't make it harder for yourself by trying to do the impossible, just because as we tick off the races, they get more and more crucial. You have to kind of treat them all the same and not say, this race is more special than this one. I can't afford to finish behind or too far off in this particular session or race. You have to be as even about it as you can, because if you're not, then you're more likely to make mistakes and then make it harder for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also go back, obviously, because we've spoken mainly about McLaren. We haven't really spoken about Max and his chances, which by the weekend they diminish, because there will be less points on the table, and there will be less chances of him getting back. But if he has a big weekend and McLaren has a poor weekend in Brazil, then we're back to a very, very tight battle for the championship between 3 drivers. But yeah, 2007 is a good example too, because it could also swing to one side of the garage one weekend, then to the other one the next weekend. But if they are ahead of Max, it's great. That's going to be a great battle between both of them. But if Max is ahead of them every weekend and wins almost every race from now until Abu Dhabi, and they start, taking points from each other, you don't have to go, too extreme to see Max winning the championship. Even with the three of them finishing on the podium, if Max is able to win these next few races, even losing one of the sprints, and one driver is good in one weekend and the other one is good in the next in the McLaren garage, it could still be up for grabs for Max.
I think the problem with the 2007 comparison, no comparison is ideal because obviously every championship is different, and that's a bit obvious to say, but it's true to say, is that Verstappen doesn't have the teammate in the mix to help. With Ferrari, they were able to get behind Raikkonen's late push, but Massa was still a factor in the races. And yes, the McLaren dynamic is similar in the sense you've got two really, really closely matched, super competitive guys who are taking points off each other, but they're only fighting against Max. So really, in ordinary circumstances, I know there are some spoilers still possible with the likes of Russell at Mercedes and Leclerc if Ferrari has a good weekend. So that it's possible that they can play a role, but in terms of the team v team dynamic, it's quite different because Verstappen is effectively fighting on his own because Tsunoda can't get into that group. If he could, then it would make Max a much more potent factor because you'd have the kind of potential for a Perez 2021 spoiler type element where he could get in the way, be disruptive to the McLaren drivers' races, give them something else to think about strategically, and that would help Max just chip away at the gap a little bit more. But actually the work he has to do at the moment is basically all on his own. So he's relying on the McLaren drivers messing up or swapping, like you say, Diego, competitiveness at each event to take points off each other or just making mistakes and having bad weekends. I feel like, as you say, because the momentum of him just winning relentlessly and taking points out of the gap every weekend is now gone because of Mexico. He needs help again. He needs McLaren, and in this case now Norris or even Piastri, to have one really bad event where he has a strong result. Otherwise, I feel like he's just going to run out of time. Yeah,
and I think actually you mentioned Russell and Ferrari drivers. They could play a role in this. And if you go and look to Vegas, Vegas is a weekend where McLaren can well be in difficulties. And if if Max is able to make the most out of the Vegas weekend, that could be a big weekend for him and a big weekend in terms of how spectacular we could reach the end of the season with drivers closer in the top three positions in the championship. So yeah, Tsunoda didn't do too bad a job in Mexico. Twice he was ahead of Piastri, and he tried to at least not make it too easy for him. He then got the best of Tsunoda coming well out of the last corner, but it took some laps for him twice to be able to overtake him. Had Tsunoda not been there, probably he would still be leading the championship because he wouldn't have lost so much time twice during the Grand Prix in Mexico. So that is as much as Tsunoda can do it right now because it doesn't seem like he has the pace to be up there with Max anytime.
I think in a way you could say Piastri's challenge, while there's added complexities with Verstappen, etc., and the challenges of the run-in, there's a certain degree of simplification in that there's no element anymore in the back of his mind of managing a points lead. So it becomes fairly straightforward, doesn't it? Between the two McLaren drivers, whoever has the better results across these 4 Grand Prix and 2 sprints will finish ahead of the other. And then you have got that question about Verstappen and managing that gap, but that's kind of the secondary bit. So Piastri will have to make sure he's absolutely sort of locked into that process focus, by which I mean do your focus one step in front of the other, do what you do, and then the result is the output. If you get too worried about focusing on the results, you lose that focus on process sometimes. And I think Piastri will be very good at that. What he does have to make sure is he's talked about trying to learn things from the struggles of Mexico in particular in the past 2 weekends. He needs to do that, but not get too kind of excessively sucked into it. It'd be very, very easy to spend huge amounts of time between now and Brazil just going over it. And he has to devote some time to that. But he needs to be kind of disciplined in terms of choosing the information and the stuff he needs to go over, trying to internalize all of that. And at the same time, giving himself a break, trying to switch off from the championship fight as well. Because if you're carrying that championship fight around with you every day now until whatever it is, December 6th, 7th in Abu Dhabi, that's really going to take its toll. And that's the easiest thing in the world to say to do and the most difficult thing to do. So that's why, coming back to the whole question of is pressure becoming a problem, et cetera, this is what we will find out, because we'll get a big enough sample set to decide if there's a trend. And Piastri himself, there's some ways you can physiologically measure stress responses. You can kind of sort of quantify pressure. There's ways to do it, and you can learn a bit. But it's also an intangible, even when you're there at the center of it. So because it's an intangible as well, it becomes harder to deal with. So I think that's a fascinating challenge, and it's a thing that both drivers will go through. Because if we know one thing, there's 3 drivers in this title fight. We know which one is the least susceptible to that pressure, and that's Max. There's certain other circumstances where sometimes he can be pushed into a place where he becomes a bit counterproductive. Spain is the example of that, the obvious example of that this year. But
he'll be kicking himself if he loses this championship by the amount of points he could have gained by not self-immolating in Barcelona. Then it will be back to the old, Max, you could have done it if you just kept a lid on it. But then also you mentioned Max, Ed, he's been through it. 2021, he was tight, wasn't he, in this part of the season? There were mistakes. He was banging into Lewis Hamilton. It was really, really tense. And you could almost see, I know, setting aside the controversial finale, you could see the release of tension when he finally got over the line and it was done. And he's driven differently and with more freedom and less pressure ever since. So however it goes, provided it's one of the McLaren drivers winning it and not Max again, that will have a huge impact. Not only in terms of relieving the stress of this season, which is, as you say, inevitable, even if they do their level best to hide it, it will impact then how they perform going into the seasons ahead, because getting over that hump, it seems like there's one in terms of like winning your first race, but winning the championship seems to be like the biggest mental relief you could possibly have as a Formula One driver.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to Max if he wins the championship or he doesn't. He's got 4 of them. No. For Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, it does, because there's no assurance that those 2 drivers will ever get another shot at the World Championship.
It's monumental, isn't it? Yeah, it's monumental.
You can say they probably will, but what would we have said about Fernando Alonso at the end of 2006? Are we going to say he's never going to win another World Championship? Of course not. So you can take nothing for granted, and that'll just be a little thing in the back of the mind. The key is to shut it off. But I would say, I think overall, just to kind of wrap up on Piastri himself, he shouldn't be underestimated. Just because he's had this sort of wobble, and Baku was a disaster. So you'd have to say 3 of those 4 races, Baku, Austin, Mexico, have gone pretty badly for him, no question. I think Singapore, he qualified ahead of Norris. That was its own thing. But don't underestimate him. He is still a mentally robust driver. I think he does have the capacity of anyone in this scenario facing their first championship battle, only in their 3rd season. You'd say the psychology of Piastri should give him a good chance and an opportunity. And there's no reason why he can't go out, win 4 of the last 6 races, and he's world champion. Everyone's saying, the way you bounced back from that dip was brilliant. That shows why you're a world champion. So we don't know what this little run of 3 tricky and disappointing events in 4 actually means. It could mean everything for the best in terms of the way he responds, or it could mean everything for the worst. So is anyone giving up on Piastri? Because I think the evidence we've got is that we absolutely should.
No, I'm not giving up on him. I think he does have a tough run. I think if you were identifying a run of tracks that would be more favourable to Norris than him, before even the season started, you would pick the last part and say, that's Norris territory, with the exception of Vegas. So he's anyway got work to do. I just think the problem for Piastri is it's heightened. There's almost double work to do because, as you say, he's coming off a slump, he's coming off a bad run. So it's not like he's had a normal run into now a tricky period. He's got a tricky period leading into another tricky period. But, again, he's just got to take it one race at a time and do the work. He's shown at the other tracks where he struggled last season, that he's capable of completely turning that around. China, he was rubbish there last year and he dominated this year. Spain, he was rubbish at last year, dominated Norris this year. So he can do it. He just got to do it again.
How about you, Diego? Are you still thinking that Piastri's absolutely in this fight?
Absolutely. I mean, the very fact that he doesn't have anything to take care of because he's not the championship leader anymore just frees, I guess, some of that pressure that he's held for the past few weeks when he hasn't had the best performance, and he sees the gap closing every weekend, not only with Lando but also with Max. So, I mean, when we go back to the beginning of the year, I think Jeddah was one race which showed how good Oscar was at, let's say, for example, racing Max, relative to what we had seen from Lando racing Max. He was, his approach, I think, was better, and he actually was able to overcome Max to win in Jeddah, you know. And we also saw that in Miami, I think. So he has a lot of strengths and areas where he could be better than Lando. If Lando, doesn't make mistakes as he has done in the first part of the championship, it could be more difficult. But he also has to, right now he has to deploy all his tools, all his strengths to be able to win this championship, because is there for him to get. He is not leading it, but he is almost even with Lando, and he has shown he has almost everything it takes to become a world champion. So he's still very much a candidate for it, and he doesn't have now the pressure of being the leader. Now we will see if that pressure affects Lando, and if he stumbles again, like he has done so many times when he has looked like he is right on top of his game and then comes down again at some point.
Let's take a little bit of a look at Lando Norris now, Diego, because the corollary of Oscar Piastri's trouble is that Lando Norris is on the rise. He's gained 35 points on Piastri since that PU problem cost him in Zandvoort. What change, if any, have you seen in Lando Norris?
I think, if anything, his racing has been more aggressive, but in a slightly more controlled way than probably Canada or Austria, Austin last year. He did some good overtakes on Leclerc in Austin 2 weeks ago. The turn one incident actually in the sprint in Austin was partly because of how aggressive Lando was in terms of not giving Oscar any room on the outside, which somehow forced Oscar to do the cutback that ended up in contact with Hülkenberg and subsequently also with Lando. But probably behind this, there is an underlying improvement in Lando's performance after Singapore and that 30-minute meeting that he has mentioned, and the way the team has reacted after that also, to give him what he needs in order to get the feeling of the car that allows him to perform at the level he did back in Mexico. So I'd say that. And you could say that since Papaya Rules last played a big role in Monza, I don't know how much of that has empowered Lando in some way.
Yeah, I get the sense that Norris has been getting a little bit more assured, but again, that's what the final few races will firmly test. But he does have that advantage of experience, doesn't he, over Piastri? He knows what works for him. That's what that whole post-Singapore debrief was. It was like, no, I need this in the car if I'm going to win more races. And just having that data bank of past experience and knowledge makes it easier to make those calls. Piastri will probably be thinking, right, I need to do the same. Actually, what exactly do I want? Now, he'll have a good idea, but just by definition, a driver who's got twice as much experience is just going to have a better answer to that question. That's just the way that it is, and that's the strength that Norris has got. What do you think, Ben? Because we could just see Mexico is just another high point for Norris that doesn't tell us anything, because we know he can have these weekends where, because he's an exquisitely good driver, he can be absolutely brilliant. But we know the strengths and we know the weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses is he can have that weekend and then he can have a pretty bad weekend, or he can have a weekend like Saudi where he was clearly quicker, but because he couldn't,
because he stuffed it in the wall.
Well, because he put it in the wall. But I think it was because, I think that was partly because that was a place where Piastri was quicker. And we saw that in China as well, when in the sprint quali he went for that braking late at the hairpin, because Piastri did. He wasn't so good at filtering out, right, what can I do, what can't I do? Now, this is quite a few months after those particular incidents. We're 6 months on. So he may have learned from that as well. So there's almost as much to learn about Lando Norris as there is about Piastri, isn't there?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's interesting that Diego raised this debrief that Lando's mentioned after Singapore. You know, he talked about this on TV after Mexico, that they had 30 minutes where he basically told McLaren, if you don't change something to give me the feeling I want, we're not going to win any more races. And he's obviously, done what you need to do as an experienced driver going for the championship, asserted himself. And I think it shows the power of a bad weekend, actually, because Singapore last season was one of these stronghold Norris races. You mentioned, in your phraseology, he can be exquisite. Basically, he can obliterate the field when things are right for him. And he did that in Mexico this year. Last year, he did it a few times. He did it at Zandvoort and he did it at Singapore. And he probably came back to Singapore this year thinking, right, okay, this is where I'm going to be the nuts. And as it was close, but Piastri was quicker. Norris had a disappointing qualifying, got ahead in the race, but controversially. So he would have come out of that race thinking, oh, I've lost ground. Like this shouldn't be happening. And he's obviously then in the moment gone, well, why is that? It's because we don't know the specifics, but there's something about how the car's performing, behaving, that's got away from him, hasn't allowed him to do what he knows he can do on a track where he's proved he can do it. And he's been able to, I think, use that circumstance to crystallize it and then get McLaren to kind of course correct. And then we've seen him take a step at two tracks where, we know he's strong, but it's in harmony with the equipment. So what Piastri has to do is kind of take that lesson and be like, okay, well, these are two tracks where I was weak last year. I haven't made the step that I made this year that I have been able to do in other places. Why is that? And if he can then assert himself and say to McLaren, look, I need this from the car within the realms of possibility, then he should be able to course correct as well. But it's still true to say, as regards Norris, that he's gone from below par for him weekend in Singapore, decent weekend in Austin where he overcame the Ferrari, but obviously didn't beat Max, and then an exquisite weekend in Mexico. He probably could have had that weekend in Mexico last year, but for the kind of weirdness of fighting Verstappen and Verstappen trying to kind of professionally foul him, if you like, to make sure he didn't win. So that it's not necessarily true to say that suddenly Norris has unlocked something amazing from the McLaren that's going to carry him through the rest of the season. It could just be the repetition of two tracks where he's strong last year, but the circumstances and a bit of greater experience, confidence, just hitting the ground running even from the start of the weekend has just allowed him to express himself a bit more than he did previously.
Just underlines what a great setup we've got for the championship finale run-in, hasn't it? Because we've got these two drivers in McLaren who there's still question marks over, and then you've got this kind of relentless Max Verstappen.
The juggernaut, yeah.
Exactly, sort of looming up behind them, which is just the perfect setup. So, really looking forward to it. Now, one thing, Diego, one more question from the Race Members Club. And if you're interested in the Race Members Club, head to patreon.com, search for the race, click the link in the episode description to find out more about all the extra content we do. This one's from Brian Mortensen. And you're very well placed to answer this because you were, obviously, you know the region well, and you were working on the circuit TV presentation there. But yeah, that's what it's about, all about the booing. Brian Mortensen said, any intel on why Norris was seemingly booed by the fans in the stadium post-race in Mexico? That's a great question. I want to know the answer as well, because when this was happening, I was doing the pen after the race where all the drivers come through, and that's basically right next to the stadium. You sort of got the podium behind you and all the crowd and everything, so you could hear this booing, and you're like, what's going on there? So what's it all about?
Well, I hope I can get as close to the real answer to this as possible, but Lando got a question actually on the post-race press conference, which implied the answer to this being Lando having a perceived preferential treatment from McLaren. This in a weekend where Oscar struggled, leading to conspiracies getting even more steam than before. So, as you can remember, there was a similar reaction from the people in Monza in the podium when we had these papaya rules and team orders after the bad pit stop for Lando. So it may sound louder in Mexico, but maybe it's due to the acoustics of the stadium. But I think it goes in line with what happened at Monza and those kind of decisions. As much as all drivers deserve full respect from any crowd, I think also that it's part of the sport that only shows how passionate the fans are, how much are they into what's going on with the championship. But you can remember Max, Lewis, Michael Schumacher, the greatest champions, have been on the receiving end of the crowd at some point. So fans, I think, don't like manipulation of what they see on track. So bottom line, in my opinion, is this is an unintended consequence of how papaya rules have played out in public recently, and the perception from a number of fans who don't necessarily feel there is fairness where McLaren is trying to impose it.
Yeah, they're booing McLaren, really, aren't they? Norris is just the sort of conduit for the real target, which is Zach Brown and Andrea Stella in the paddock. They agree with me, Ed. They think papaya rules is a load of nonsense. So I think Mexico's on my side.
Well, I think if there's one thing we've learned about papaya rules, there are many unintended consequences, and that is one of them. And yeah, it's a good point about actually how noticeable it is because of that stadium. It's a remarkable spot in terms of the loudness of the fans there. So yeah, I'm personally not a booer, but you know,
you were in. I bet you were there from the pen, joining in. Boo!
if there's one thing I do when doing the pen, it's I generally just get irritated. If there's any noise, it means I can't hear. So
Norris would have respected you if you'd booed him because he said that he enjoyed it.
Well, there we go. There's a point where I just want to go around into the stadium and say, can everyone just quieten down a bit? I'm trying to listen to what Gabriel Bortoleto has to say about his first lap. So probably best I'm not in charge of how much noise fan makes. But no, it's just interesting to get a bit of an understanding of what the thinking is. And yeah, that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, and one side note about the acoustics of it's called Estadio GNP Seguros. That's the actual name of the stadium that we used to know as the Foro Sol. And from what they say, it's the venue with the most number of concerts in the year anywhere in the world. So it's done for acoustic reasons. So the
perfect place for booing.
Exactly.
That is a great fact. I didn't know that one. That was definitely in your preparatory notes for doing the TV stuff for the circuit presentation at the weekend. So you've earned your place on this podcast, Diego, with that.
Thank you so much.
You left it late, but last lap you dived in there.
It's all about how you finish. It's not how you start. It's the same in the World Championship as it is on this podcast.
Exactly. So let's finish on a high. Thanks very much, Diego and Ben. Thanks to those who sent in questions as well that we drew on for this podcast. Long way to go now. Not too long until Brazil, at least. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.